Into the tiny hats and slavery. Yes, this was left out of the history books because guess who owns the history books? Those tiny hats over here. And when we look at who owned all the slaves and were the slave traders and the auctioneers, tiny hats. And who owned the newspapers? Tiny hats. And then who also created the division? Oh, I think you're starting to understand it. And then you also find about the exploitation of the slaves and how they treated people. Obviously, they're not going to tell anybody this part. And then it also gets interesting when you find out that the tiny hats were defending that they should stay slaves. Isn't that interesting? And people would say, no, that would never happen, really. Slave dealing was an extremely profitable business. And this is where it always ties back to the Rothschilds, like I've always talked about.
So let's read this. So he's insinuating that the transatlantic slave trade was all run by the Jews. Slavery played an unacknowledged role in this question of Jewish status in Old South, although Southern society fostered a caste system which also applied to the various classes of whites and which distinguished the storekeeper from the wealthier merchant. In turn from the professional man, and the attorney turned physician from the planter. The all-pervasive division was between the races. The Jews were white, and this very fact goes a long way towards accounting for the measurably higher social and political status achieved by Jews in the South than in the North. Foreign observers like Solomon de Rothschild and Benjamin were actually aware of the sharp contrast between the South.
Even Malcolm X talked about this. People should look into this.
And a Negro is not anti-Semitic when he says that the man who's exploiting him in his community is white, because it is a white man who owns all the stores. Now, is it an accident that these whites who own these stores are Jewish?
There you go. And so this is how it goes undercover. You look at Jang's lessons for so many years. It's the idea of crypto Jews because they are a minority infiltrating other groups and blending in, converting to Christianity, converting to Islam, and even converting to whiteness. Because back then, looks at during the transatlantic slave trade, Jews were considered white. It was based off skin tone, not specifically pointing out the religious ethno-ideology that Judaism is. Now they make the distinction. Ben Shapiro says publicly that he's not white. Judaism is a separate ethnicity. But it seems like back then during the slave trade, that wasn't the case.
If it's an accident, then the fact that he says the Jew on the corner is exploiting me isn't an anti-Semitic statement. It's just more descriptive of the man who's exploiting him.
And that book here that he's referencing it was even written by a Jew. The Old South, 1789 to 1865. Bertram Wallace Corn. Let's see. Let's fact check. Oh. Well, no, it's more recent, actually. Well, it is written by a Jew, but...
That's over here.
Moving on.